In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate.
Distinguished guests, Your Excellencies, it's a great pleasure to be with you today at the start of 2017, a year that we hope, inshallah, will bring peace, stability, and prosperity to the Arab world, to the whole world, including the Arab world, but especially to a very dear country that we have all been concerned about. A country that has gone through immense instability, unprecedented conflict, and where we've witnessed the extent of brutality and savagery that can be inflicted upon innocent civilians, hospitals, schools, cities, with profound implications for the future of the country. I think I speak for most of you when I say that Syria has become a source of pain for many of us. News about Syria has become difficult to follow, more difficult to understand, and hence 2016 closed on a very sad, tragic note with immense uncertainty about the future of the country. It's from that perspective that we hope, inshallah, that 2017 will be the start of peace, stability, peace building, reconstruction, communal harmony, and the re-emergence of a Syrian state. How we get there and what happens next, I think, is where a lot of us are having struggle thinking through present-day dynamics and through the uncertainty that this conflict has engendered all along. To this end, we're fortunate to have assembled a panel of long-term, highly knowledgeable experts on Syria and the Middle East. Many of them have followed this conflict from day one. I think you recognize some of them have been part and parcel of most initiatives on the political side to bring negotiated settlement, to bring stability, and bring an end to the conflict. I will not go through their detailed bios as a result, but only to remind you of who they are. Immediately to my left, Sheikh Ahmed Moaz Al-Khatib, who most of you remember was the president of the National Coalition of Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces in 2013. He did not stay in that position for a long time, but made significant contributions to a national dialogue, to peace efforts, and to mobilizing the revolutionary and opposition forces. He did so from his perspective of a scholar, an activist, a community leader. After all, he was the preacher at the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus and chairman of the Islamic Civilization Society for a while before the regime made that an impossible task. To his left is Daniel Byman, a former colleague at Georgetown University, where he serves as professor of security studies, helped build the security studies program, and for over a decade now has been affiliated with Brookings through the Washington Middle East program in his capacity of a researcher, speaker, program manager, and one whose thinking has influenced many US administrations and who continues to produce a high-quality scholarship on issues that have to do with security, geopolitics, terrorism, and counterterrorism. To his left is also a dear friend, a former dear friend from Georgetown University. Many, many years ago, Louay Safi served as a visiting professor at many universities, including at Georgetown in Washington. He has produced over 15 years in the course of his academic career books that have dealt with questions of religion, Islam, community, transitions, modernization, moderation, religious revival. He was for a very long time also engaged in public and policy discussions in Washington in the aftermath of the 9/11 events in 2001. Between the three of them and your active engagement, we hope we can make some progress today to help at least give us some hope in the possibility of a better Syria tomorrow, certainly a better Syria for its people and for the region and the world at large. I'm going to start initially by asking our distinguished panelists to share with us their visions, their thoughts on what could happen in 2017. How can we go from where we are today to better prospects for Syria? And I'll start initially with Sheikh Moaz to share his thoughts.
السلام عليكم جميعا.
If you notice the history of conflicts in the world, they must end at some time. But the interventions in any issue might be delayed for some time. For example, the Spanish Civil War, if it wasn't for the different intervention, it might have continued for only a few years, but it continued from 1932 to 35 until 1972, as I remember. Now, as for Syria, it is a very complicated issue, but I think that there's a sort of political wills, analytical of positive interventions might push this issue to a better situation or better status. Otherwise, this issue will not only be complicated in Syria, which is very important, because if it's not solved, it will be a point, it will expand to the whole region and even more than that. I am still optimistic, and I hope that there will be a sort of beginning for a solution. And I know that, during these past 6 years, what happened, and this cannot be changed in 6 or 10 or 20 years. It needs a lot of time. But what I say, what one must stop at this point is say enough and begin changing radically the way we are addressing this issue. And maybe through the discussion with other colleagues here, we might explain some points in details. Thank you, Sheikh, but I want to pose the question right from the beginning. Do you think that this year will be other opportunities or more opportunities for a positive change on the ground? Dear friend, you know what's happening in Syria is that it has become a battlefield for national, regional, international forces. That's why these conflicts and battles, if they are limited or restrained, one might begin having a beginning of a solution, but this requires the cooperation of all parties. Thank you. Mr. Louay, as a Syrian citizen and an activist, please, we want you to give us a preliminary intervention about the topic. First of all, I would like to thank Brookings Center for inviting me and for discussing this very important issue, which is very important. In the beginning, I would like to raise some points that might be the general framework about the situation in Syria. The first point is that the conflict in Syria is a conflict of different levels. In its most simple level, it is a conflict which is the result of the will of the majority of Syrians to change their political regime, which is a dictatorship, the sectarian regime, and to put an end to the corruption, administrative and financial corruption, in such a way that Syrians are finding, most of the Syrians are finding difficulty to make their living in the country, and that's why they are fleeing or migrating elsewhere. But this conflict is not is not what we are seeing today. What we are seeing today is a geopolitical conflict. This is now a battlefield for international forces that want to expand their influence zone and to be in control of the different parts of the Middle East. This is the first point, and maybe we will expand this point later on during the discussions. About this very point, and I agree with my friend Sheikh Moaz, that this geopolitical battle or conflict will not come to an end through simple battles or some victories achieved by the regime. No, in fact, the complexity of this regime will be seen next year. Syria, as you know, is a central state or government, and in Syria, people are very much attached and proud of their entities, of their freedom, and now we are facing a period of foreign occupation. The forces on the Syrian territory are Russian and Iranian, and both are using this battle to expand their influence. This is the first point. The second point about the Battle of Aleppo. I think the Aleppo battle has changed the balance of forces. It's now in favor of the regime because the regime the opposition don't have air force nor advanced weaponry. That's why attacking Aleppo was and making it fall down in the favor of the regime was the result. But even if the regime wins all the battles, it will lose at the end because this is the battle waged against the majority of the Syrian people, and will never be victorious because they want to put the country into a period of uncertainty and a lot of problems that will not end until the fall of the regime. Last point, I think that the present year, 2017, will witness a sort of escalation in the fights and the battles because the new American administration, that of Mr. Trump, will have a priority in stopping or restricting the Iranian influence, and the security advisors of Trump are, of course, the first who want to restrict and stop the Iranian expansion and influence, which was expanded to a large extent during Obama's administration, in a way that one cannot understand how could Obama accept such a big expansion of the Iranian influence in the region. But I think the situation will change. And consequently, there are now some new action, new movements that will make things even more complicated because Russia will insist to have good strategic relations with Iran, and Turkey might now is moving to the other side, not in the final way, but maybe that is only the beginning or the first depends on what will Trump do in his first steps. And I think Turkey will be closer to this and will create a new axis to face the Western policies in the region. And this, of course, will make things even more complicated. I stop at this point and then come back later on to more discussion of this point.
Let me add my thanks and also my thanks to be on this panel with such distinguished colleagues. It's a tremendous honor for me. My value on this panel is to present a Washington, D.C. perspective. And right now that's exceptionally difficult because there's a new president coming in. And every time a new president comes in, there's tremendous uncertainty. You may remember 8 years ago, President Obama was going to close the prison at Guantanamo. He was going to withdraw all U.S. forces from Iraq. And needless to say, not all of his promises came true. And that's consistent for U.S. history. But under the Trump administration, this uncertainty is magnified tremendously. And you can look at his advisors and see that they have tremendously different positions. There's no consistency across the people he has appointed. Some have positions, such as the incoming Secretary of State, that we simply don't know. The president himself has no track record whatsoever in foreign policy. So we can't look at past actions, we can only look at his words, often expressed in the form of tweets, as a guide to what America's foreign policy is going to be. The president-elect himself is tremendously erratic. He changes his positions regularly. He denies his own words on a regular basis. He's also very sensitive and personalizes most policy issues. So if there is a country that disagrees with the United States, he translates it as a leader who disagrees with him. And this allows us to tell ourselves any story we want. You can look at this and find optimism. You can look at it and be terrified. And so there's a tremendous uncertainty. So let me simply say a few observations that make it, in my view, more complex, but may help us understand some things. One is that under Obama, the United States considered 3 different interests in Syria. The U.S. thought about the stability of Syria and the region in general as a concern. A second concern was humanitarian, the massive death and refugee flow. And a third concern was counterterrorism. Under President Trump, there's only one concern, which is counterterrorism. Frankly, he doesn't care too much about the region. He also has no interest in the humanitarian issue and is unlikely to do anything for refugees. So we come down to a policy on Syria driven by counterterrorism. And here things are rather strange because the Obama campaign against Daesh has made progress. Long way to go, but it's a much better picture than it was 2 years ago. But in the United States, the perception is that the Islamic State is 10 feet tall. Most Americans think the group is ascendant, that it's doing quite well, that attacks are imminent, and that's a false statement in my view, but it is widely believed. And so if you look at what Trump has said on Syria and what he wants to do, it's a mess of contradictions. So he's pointed to U.S. policy in Iraq in the past and said somewhat correctly, in my view, that it was a disaster, that the United States should never do anything like that again. He has also made it clear that he does not want to do anything to help Syrians who might be fleeing the war, that he regards them as potential terrorists, and the United States and other countries are best if they shut the door. He has talked about bombing the Islamic State to death, but in a way that's very unclear. It's unclear how that would be different from current U.S. policy, except that there would be less effort to care about the casualties among civilians. He has talked about the need for an alliance with Russia. And he stayed to this despite the unpopularity of this. And so he has pushed this point to the point where people have talked about the United States working with Russia in Syria. That's a rather staggering and upsetting proposition to me, but it is nevertheless something that the president and a few of his advisors have considered. But he has also said that Iranian influence is dangerous, and many of his constituents and the people he's appointed are strongly anti-Iran. So he somehow wants to work with Russia, but not with Iran and Syria, even though Russia and Iran are on the same side. He is also skeptical of traditional American allies. He has been skeptical of Saudi Arabia. On a more local level, he has been extremely skeptical of different parts of the Syrian opposition, with kind of a statement where, in the end, it's very hard to tell who's a terrorist and who's not. So the United States is better off keeping them all away from U.S. policy. my sense of all this is that he's coming in without a plan. He's coming in with a series of beliefs that are contradictory and don't give us guidance as to where policy is going to go. And policy is thus likely to be somewhat contradictory, but what may change all this is a significant terrorist attack that is linked to Syria, where there the president will feel an obligation for the United States to act very aggressively in a way President Obama never did. And that may lead the United States to escalate quite dramatically what it's doing, but not necessarily in a coherent way. And so US policy to me is likely to be crisis driven. So rather than think about it rationally beforehand, the United States is going to wait until the problems are at their worst. And that will drive many of the decisions. And as you can tell, I'm rather depressed by where I think things are going. But I think the potential for dramatic change is considerable.
I think I'm depressed just listening to the three of you. الشيخ موعد معلش يعني أنا I want to think
أريد أن أفكر
a solution. And what I've heard is Syria will continue to be a battleground where external powers interfere. The US administration has no clear idea of where it wants to lean and what it is likely to do. Based on the discussions I've heard so far, you're left with the impression that 2017 is likely to be a continuation of what happened in 2016, maybe even worse. هل الانطباع هذا يعني سليم؟
Is this a real kind of impression from your opinion? I would like to comment on what my dear colleague had said. First, the American administration is not going to do anything positive in the coming 2 years at least. This is not only a joke, but it is going to continue between a year and 2 years until they understand the different dossiers and files. They need to understand these files for them to be able to take the right decisions vis-à-vis Syria. This is on the one hand, and we have seen that the different American administrations, they have a strong loophole when it comes to the understanding of the social and psychological positions of nations, and also the existence of extremist thinking. One of the main reasons behind it is the way the American administration behaved in Iraq, which was a great failure that was followed with other failures in Syria and Libya. We should not wait from the American administration anything that is going to be very clear, at least after a year or two, until they understand the different dossiers. Perhaps the United States of America, as usual, would think based on its own muscles, not based on its brain. And this is going to lead to catastrophes in the world. And this is no longer a game or a regional or local game. Any issue that might happen is going to expand to the rest of the world, taking into account that the different media has made it possible for the terrorist groups to meet without having to meet physically together. And this is going to give rise to so many sleeper cells. The stay of the regime in power in its current format is a great problem for Syria. And if there is no change to take place, and you know that the regime has contributed to the rise of extremist movements in the region. So the continuation of this situation is going to be very dangerous indeed. And at the same time, we would like to have some kind of change, meticulous change, a meticulous surgical kind of change, and not in the way that is based on muscles that would lead only to more catastrophes and problems. The third thing, unfortunately, up to now, the tactical way of thinking is the predominant kind of thinking in local and international issues. We have tried the axis that was headed by the United States for 6 years. What are the results? For 6 years, inside the American administration. And this is no secret. The last time Kerry tried to communicate with the Russians, in the second day, the American forces have targeted a camp in Deir ez-Zor to send the message that even inside the United States of America, there is no margin for the movement to take permission from the military order. And this kind of access was tried for 6 years. I do not want to say that it was a failure. Some of the things were premeditated, and the players, they said they're going to get some gains, but they failed all. So the crisis in Syria, nobody's going to win in Syria. This is going to be a defeat in battle for everybody. There is another issue which is very sensitive indeed. You know that the Russians are trying to come up with an initiative in order to find a political solution to exit the issue. If this solution is opposed as part of the regional and international confrontations, this is going to lead to the loss of a very important opportunity that can be successful or a failure. But if this attempt is ignored and marginalized, this is going to lead to the fact that the Russians are going to solely solve the Syrian issue. That means that the Russian and the Iranian occupation of Syria is going to continue endlessly. So it is required of the different countries, the countries that are keen for the stability of the country. I'm not talking about interests only. They have to be very positive vis-à-vis any opportunity for a political solution, and they should support the political solution, and they should not leave it in the hands of one party, because we do not want them to reap the harvest of what is taking place solely. Within this kind of scenario and situation, I would like to say the United States is not going to effectively intervene for a long period of time. This is if they can. There are roles to be played by other regional powers, such as Turkey, such as Saudi Arabia. And there is a very important role that is going to be played by the EU, which also suffers from fragmentation and issues as a result of the Syrian situation. There is an issue that is not political, but I would like to tell you that political interests are harmful to anybody and inimical to everybody. I think the humanitarian dimension should be taken into account, should be a priority for us to be able to find a solution. Otherwise, the crises are going to continue and the expansions are going to be unlimited. In Egypt, you know that the leaders of the political parties, most of them, especially the Islamists, are in prisons. So this is a very intricate situation. Who is benefiting from such a situation? Only one party, which are the extremist groups. And please do not be surprised if there is an army that rises and that includes, for instance, 4 million fighters or 500,000 fighters that have extremist way of thinking. And this body is going to see a great deal of response due to the oppressive, unjust policies by so many international powers that have not taken the international perspective in the first place. They put not the interests of their own people, but the limited interests of officials who have no expertise nor humanity. Thank you.
Dr. Louay.
Dr. Louay, in the framework of following the same idea or to shed light on some other aspects in it, Sheikh Moaz spoke about it is necessary to take into consideration the Turkish role, the Iranian role, and the role of other Arab countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other countries. In your opinion, is it possible to imagine a political solution based on a regional settlement in light of the present situation in a way that guarantees that the political process will be successful to some extent?
Responding to you. I think it's possible. It's possible to shift the dynamics of the region at this point. Things have not been pushed beyond, beyond the point of no return. I could see the possibility of further radicalization of the region. In the same way, US policies in Iran led to radicalization in Iran, and now several administrations are trying to deal with that issue. That could happen in the Middle East. And there is a very dangerous game now is being played in Washington. I mean, this confusion about who is the friend and who is the enemy in the Middle East is quite alarming. And that's not good. Now, definitely the Middle East needs a change. I mean, you cannot postpone. I mean, anyone who learned a bit about history knows that you cannot postpone and you cannot prevent forever a change that whose time has come. I mean, the region cannot be ruled anymore by dictators. And it seems that this old policy of let us deal with dictators and support them in order to control the country and look at the region only in the through the geopolitical lens without any concern for the dignity and the right of the people, this will not work. You have now millions of young Arabs in the entire Arab world wanting to have a good life, wanting to have jobs, wanting to be respected, want to live under a rule of law, not rule of the whims of who is ever in power. I mean, we have seen that. And in fact, the new dictators are even worse than the one who came before them. So things keep escalating. I don't know. So I feel that there is a need to change. Somebody has to relook at the issue in terms of the escalation of and deterioration of political conditions in the Middle East. So what it will take to change that dynamics is really to help in providing some sort of transition, political transition in Syria. This crazy policy of trying to sort of buff up and support the Assad regime, either by default, the American side, or actively as the Russians are doing, is crazy. Anyone who thinks that this regime can survive is not thinking rationally, because I feel and I see that even if the regime would win the military battles, this regime is going to lose the war. This is a war on the majority of Syrians. And these majorities, many of them have been pushed outside the country. And this ethnic cleansing continues to happen under our eyes. Nobody is saying anything. The West has already turned his face to the other side, so they don't see what's happening. There's ethnic cleansing today in Syria based on sectarian preferences. So if you are Shia and Alawi, you can stay in some places. If you are not, then the Iranians are purging certain areas to create this corridor between Tehran and southern Lebanon. But that means that now the instability of the whole region is at stake. I mean, anyone who doesn't see that instability or the prospect of greater instability, again, is not thinking rationally. So what has to happen is that I don't say the Russians are going to do it. I would disagree here a bit with my friend. The Russians are bent on supporting Assad at any cost. And all their political maneuvers have been to disarm the opposition and to divide the opposition and to create their own opposition that they can live with. But that is not going to work. So the new US administration has to really think about how to achieve at least an acceptable level of participation of the majority. You can't have really at this age just a sectarian minority supported by fanatical regime trying to rule the country despite the will of the majority of the people. Now the Syrians, as I said earlier, are very proud people. They have moved all the way to Central Europe, and in fact, this destabilization can create a new geopolitics in the entire region, including Europe. So I think that Syria is not a game. It has to be treated more seriously. the interests of the people, which I started by saying the first conflict, the real conflict initially in Syria is about a dictatorship, and people want not to change that regime, in fact. The first call on the regime is to create more political room for people to have freedom of speech, to criticize all the corruption that is have been bleeding the country into the state of poverty. So that has to be taken into account. If you ignore it, then you are really creating a new dynamics that will destabilize the entire Middle East.
Thank you, Louay. We will come to you for your questions in just a few moments, but I just wanted to pose one question to Dan. Dan, is it possible to imagine, well, let me preface what I'm about to say by referring to what you've just said. We don't know what the next administration in the US is likely to do. They have not made any specific policy proposals, and they've not been clear about their overall strategy for engaging with the Arab world, with the Middle East, including on Syria. But President-elect Trump has consistently said he wants to work with Russia. And there is every expectation that he might be able to work with Russia. And if that happens, wouldn't Syria possibly be one of the first issues they could discuss, agree to cooperate on, and possibly lay the foundation for a framework, a political framework for a solution? Should we be skeptical about this, or should we give them the benefit of the doubt?
I would not give them the benefit of the doubt. What I would say is the primary area of cooperation and interest for Russia is Europe. Russia's concerns over Crimea, Russia's concerns over Ukraine, Russia's concerns over the Baltic states. These are true priorities and deep strategic interests for the Russian state. Syria is an effective way of showing leadership in the world and of undermining US leadership in the world. And so I think that's less important to Russia. The challenge for Trump administration is if it were just Russia backing the Assad regime, that would be one thing. But it's Russia and Iran backing the Assad regime. And the administration has made a point of saying it is very skeptical of the Obama administration's efforts to do a deal over nuclear weapons with Iran. That some of its leaders have been very skeptical of Iran's role in the region in general. And to put in place a regime in Syria that has an even more dominant Iranian role than it did 5 years ago would be criticized not only by critics of the president, but also I think by many people who are current supporters of it. The question I would say, and other colleagues here may know, is I don't think Russia would settle for anything in Syria short of the Assad regime exercising almost complete control of the country. I think Russia believes it's winning. And as a result, there's very little need to compromise. There might be a few token compromises so Russia can show that it's a great power that brings peace to the region, but in practice that compromise will mean that the Assad regime continues to rule and rules over more and more of the country. And any promises about future elections or future power sharing would be false. That they should not be taken seriously unless there's something very serious to back them up. And that would have to be some degree of military force and military commitment by the opposition to the Assad regime, whether it's the United States, whether it is states like Saudi Arabia. In the past, that might have included Turkey. And I don't believe those states are willing to do that. So I think Russia would take a deal that favors its current client. But a broader deal that is more balanced to me is unlikely. And I think a Trump administration would worry that a deal that continues Assad in power openly would be seen as a win for Iran, and it wants to avoid that for political reasons as well as strategic ones.
We will come to you for questions, comments, interventions. We'll start from this side of the room. Gentlemen, can you please introduce yourself?
السلام عليكم.
Salam.
جهاد الفا
Jihad al-Fa'uri. Sheikh Mu'adh, the question is to you about the American administration. You said that it might need time, might take 2 years. But 6 years were enough, in fact, even for those who are outside the political scene, whether Trump or his advisors. If they were outside the political landscape, the 6 years would have been enough for them to know what's happening in Syria. And there's a point about the American presence in Syria. At the time of Obama's administration, the American presence was only limited, I'm here speaking as a military man, it was only limited to the Tau rocket launchers, and in the north there was only the project, the Kurdish federal project they speak about. I don't want to mix the topics together, but there's also about combating Daesh. What has the American administration done to fight or combat Daesh? Only few. We might even memorize the names that this alliance has been able to kill amongst the Daesh elements. They did nothing to fight terrorism as it is. In fact, they enabled the terrorism to be connected from Mosul to Raqqa. So there is a failure by the American administration, a failure that Russia has well exploited, and such as that now it is the guardian and the sponsor of everything that happens in Syria. My question to Sheikh Mu'adh, what about the Russians, their interests in Syria and the Iranian interests? This is the question that we as Syrian citizens, we want to know its answer. Does Russia now really want a political solution in Syria? Many people will approve such a solution and to stop the bloodshed. So is Russia capable, or will it be capable in the coming few days, if there is a political solution is imposed, can Russia stop Iran, it's the other Shiite militias who are active in Syria? You have asked many questions and you answered the questions yourselves, in fact. What I said is that as far as the Russians are concerned, is that I will use a very simple example. The world is a big company. The CEO is United States. The executive director in Syria now is Russia. So there was a big quarrel between this CEO and the director, and the director became angry and said, this is only information, not analysis. You have worked, you fooled me in Iraq, you lied to me in Libya and created problems for me in Ukraine, so I will not leave Syria to you no matter what the price is. This is the situation, in fact. So now the Russians, whether we like it or not, are there in Syria. And I said in the beginning that the presence of other parties, the European Union, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, these factors, their presence will stop the Russian domination in Syria, and maybe Russia thinks that was fooled and was sent out of all Middle East and wants to stay in Syria, even if that leads to a third world war. So what's the solution? In fact, I am worried that maybe the Russian solution is a reproduction of the regime. And this means that all that happened was in vain. So the important thing here is that there should be other forces that do not fight the Russians or do not confront the Russians, but should also look to achieve the interests of the peoples of all the region. And there is something that's well known. which was very annoying and, for all Syrian politicians. The major countries that deal with this issue don't have a vision. Neither the American administration nor the Russians, who don't have a vision to solve this difficult problem, but they have only interest and red lines. After this, they to kill the list, as long as their interests are there and achieved. So what we say is, the Russians' efforts to achieve a political solution, if they do it by themselves, if they monopolize it, this means they will reproduce the regime, and this is very dangerous. And if there are other parties that confront the Russians, the situation will deteriorate. So what we want the other parties to face the Russians and cooperate with them to reach a political solution.
طيب لا
This is a very important point, Iran. In my opinion is not accepted by so many. Iran is a power that has double danger and threats, military and ideological threats. So Iranians have an ideological project, but unfortunately we are all looking at the points of weaknesses that we have, but we are not looking at the points of weakness of the other party. There are so many issues when it comes to the problem between the Russians and the Iranians. There are issues also between the regime and the Russians. And I would like to tell you that all parties that have deeply intervened in the Syrian situation are facing a crisis and they're looking for an exit. So to benefit from this issue, for us to be able to exit with the least losses and to benefit from the presence of the Russians in order to shorten or to limit the influence of Iran in Syria. Good evening. I am a Syrian economist. We missed his name. Since we are talking about the situation after Aleppo, I think what has happened in Aleppo is specified by what had happened before. So the performance politically and militarily of the opposition was very weak. The changing and turning point came from Turkey. So this is the new turning point that is going to have repercussions on the future. Russia today seeks to reinforce its political and military gains, and I think that Russia knows two things. It knows that the rehabilitation of the regime, as Sheikh Moaz had said, this is something that requires the continuous presence of Russians and all the militias that are there to protect the regime, because the regime and its forces are unable to regain control as it used to do. This situation is going to lead to chaos. This is a prescription for chaos. Russia knows, I think, that Iran and Turkey are best to preserve their interests in Syria rather than Iran, that is far away. And consequently, as it seems to me, we are facing three possible scenarios, and while waiting for the American administration and Trump. If Trump stands against Russia and Iran and consequently stands next to the opposition or with the opposition, this is going to lead to different opposing kind of results, opposing to what we see today, because now the military opposition inside Syria is only waiting for strikes, and the political opposition is sleeping. The second solution is the Trump administration is to stand with Russia against Russia. They're going to please Iran. They're not going to be against Iran. But this is going to be a kind of a solution based on partnership in keeping with Geneva. This is a moderate kind of solution. The last scenario is that Trump practically stands with Iran and Russia and reinstate or reproduce the regime. This, as I said, is not going to lead to stability. It's going to lead to increase in chaos, and is going to lead to more people who would be displaced and so on and so forth, and return there would be no return for the different people who have left Syria, and this is going to have an impact on the different components of Syrian society. This is a kind of a moderate or a middle way kind of solution. This is opposed by the Iranians, and they are trying to mobilize different alliances through the different clans and tribes to stand against it. And the question is to the three speakers, are these scenarios are possible? Which one is the most probable in your opinion? Dr. Louay. In my view, the Trump administration is going to deal with the region in an unstable manner, confused manner. There is an American administration that's trying to achieve two contradictory kind of objectives. On the one hand, they try to develop regimes that are close to their regime, democratic, full of liberty and freedom, but at the same time, they want to develop those regimes in order to be culturally close to the culture of the United States, and this is impossible. The problem with Trump, for instance, take the issue of Islam. For Trump and his security advisor, Michael Lynn, Islam is the problem, and not the Islamist extremist groups. So it is Islam that is the problem. So such kind of thinking is going to aggravate the situation, deteriorate it, and his position vis-à-vis the opposition is very negative. He thinks that it is not trustworthy. I do not blame him much when it comes to such a position. But the United States of America, instead of helping the opposition to unify and consolidate their efforts, they have led them and helped them divide their ranks. And I do not think that this is going to change during the coming administration. What is going to change is the way the Turks, Americans, Iranians, and Russians deal with the matter. And this is a very intricate and complex situation. Trump, as Dan had said, Trump said is going to coordinate with the Russians with regard to the Syrian situation. And this kind of coordination is impossible. Russia is not going to leave Iran behind, because it's a geopolitical kind of crisis, because they want to weaken the United States of America's influence, because the United States of America wanted to have an impact and influence inside Russia. And Putin wants to control inside Russia, and consequently, his administration is an administration in the way it holds the elections, it controls the internal situation, is no different from the Assad administration. The only difference, for instance, is the economic situation and the different balances in Russia that are different from Syria. I do not see that there is any of such things that are going to be implemented. But there is something that I would like to say, and maybe this is going to be a way of exiting the current situation and entering into a new situation. There is a difference between being in a critical position, somebody criticizing the political situation outside the regime or inside the regime. In my opinion, Trump is going to have different positions in different ways, including his position vis-à-vis Islam as a one whole, dealing with Islam as one whole, not differentiating between extremist Islam and moderate Islam by basing a society or building a society based on pluralism and diversity, or imposing a kind of a limited vision. So putting all these things in one basket is very difficult. That is why Turkey has moved towards the Russian axis. They have had a very good position by abiding, underlining the Islamic heritage, and at the same time respecting diversity. And this kind of model is going to be a very good model with regard to the changes that are taking place in the region, to make them much more democratic, much more open and diverse. And consequently, I think this is going to be a very difficult strategic problem, because the foreign policies cannot control the details of the internal situation. I cannot see a Western democratic society that respects liberties without having religious reform in Europe. And consequently, any reform was the basis of the Enlightenment age or era. That is why any cultural change in the Arab region should be based on values and ethics and religion. Here lies the role of Islam. And consequently, we have to understand the particularity of the Middle East, taking into account that these people have a religious heritage, and as long as these people establish their regimes on values of liberty and tolerance and diversity, they have to support this diversity and not reject anything that has to do with Islam, because there is a certain sensitivity with regard to this dimension. If this is not respected, I do see that there's going to be further polarization, and Turkey and Iran and Russia are going to be a very strong ally or alliance, and the Trump administration is going to threaten Iran, and is going to lead to further rapprochement between the three countries, and this is not going to be in the interest of anybody. Thank you so much.
I must be fair and take some questions from the other part of the hall or the room. The other side, sorry.
To the front here.
دكتور مصطفى كيالي. السلام عليكم.
Question to Mr. Louay.
في سوريا هو الصراع
Where? I think this conflict is a geopolitical one. We all know that the principle is that to put pressure on all the Arab region, and this region has collapsed when facing two regional powers, Iran and Turkey, especially in Aleppo and in Mosul. Today, these two forces are trying to fill in the vacuum of Iraq on Syria, and this goes along with democratic changes on the ground, and this leads to threatening not only the unity of Syria but also all the Arab security. The big question to the Syrian opposition is, what are your approaches on the military and political levels to face these challenges, to address them, and have you discussed this with your allies who are going to Astana? And will you go there without the support of your Arab brothers or people? This is a very important question. About Astana, let's begin from the end. As for Astana and the developments that took place about it, we must remember the Syrian opposition today are in two. There is the military axis, which is an axis which is close to the political one in many times, but sometimes it is contradictory to it. And it is through this axis that the countries or the regional countries and some international ones got in, because the dealing or cooperation between the military and the intelligence services of these countries is a direct one. For example, the agreement lately in Aleppo, the political opposition was outside this. Turkey took an initiative which was positive for the Syrians, because it stopped the complete victory of the regime and imposing a military status quo that might have some political implications. But the political position was not part of this dialogue or this deal. And so the Astana conference, Russia wants to invite some certain people by their names, not institutions, for example, the High Commission of negotiations is not invited. The invitations are sent by names of persons, which is an old way of the Russians to divide the opposition for ranks and to dismantle them, and then to create its own opposition that allows it to keep the regime in power. I think the Russians have not changed their approach, and anyone who listens to the Russians understands that they insist to keep Assad and keep not only Assad but also a sectarian regime that will the religious sectarian regime, which is the Alawite ones, and not as a regime with political participation of citizens who are all equal in their citizenship rights. Consequently, this weakens the opposition. But in the long term, I think the political opposition will be more effective and more important. And this opposition still refuses to capitulate and to accept the regime. Most of them, of course, there are some parts of the opposition are even ready to make alliances, even with the devil. But the political opposition in general rejects the regime and think that the political transition must be achieved in a way that guarantees a life of dignity and freedom. And any opposition to Assad will create problems and difficulties in Syria and will not allow Syria to be back to what it was. And Syria will continue to be just like Somalia. But Syria's position is not that of Somalia. A geographical, political, and cultural one is different from that of Somalia. So this is an appeal to weaken the region. Maybe Syria is the point that might be the balance point for all the region, or if it's broken, that would lead to a completely new situation for the whole region. And I think nobody else has any idea of what will be the final situation, which definitely be different from what is now. And Iran will have a main and principal reason in deciding how this new Middle East will be. And I think this. But I think the peoples of the region cannot be ruled by this way, and using military occupation and strength has failed all over the world and will fail also at this point of the history of humanity. Because at this point of the humanity history, it's not acceptable to use the tools of the 18th and 17th or 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century.
Because it seems we have forgotten about ISIS in all of this. What role does ISIS play in making things more difficult, making a political settlement more likely, helping to perhaps bring coordination between the US, Russia, and maybe it can create, possibly or otherwise, the potential for an international consensus around the areas to focus on in Syria, militarily, and the areas to focus on politically.
One thing that has been a political challenge for the Obama administration is convincing the American people that its efforts against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria has made progress. And you could look at the map and you could see that the amount of territory controlled is roughly half of what it was 2 years ago in Iraq, that in Syria, roughly a quarter, that the number of volunteer fighters who have come from Europe or the United States or the Arab world outside Iraq and Syria has gone down from over 1,000 a month to perhaps a few dozen, that the money ISIS has gone from tens of millions to a much smaller amount. All these have been huge successes. But the problem has been political for the United States and for Europe, which is that terrorism itself is very cheap and terrorism is very easy. So as the Islamic State has lost its ability to govern territory, as it's lost its ability to fight militarily, it's actually quite easy for it to continue to do terrorist attacks. So we've seen them in Europe, of course, but we've seen them throughout Iraq. We've seen them in Turkey. And this ability to do repeated attacks creates political pressure on governments, where they feel compelled to act and to act strongly. And what that tends to lead to is an emphasis on military action over political settlement. And so there'll be an emphasis on governments that want to look very strong. And whether that's bombing or more direct intervention with ground troops, there'll be pressure. The one thing about ISIS that makes them ideal as an enemy is that they hate everyone. That they have fought far more against other Syrian groups than anyone else. They have fought against regional governments. They have fought, of course, against the United States, against Europe, against Russia. So that is a common area of interest that everyone wants to stop them. The problem is no one has an answer to the next question, which is once we throw ISIS out of Raqqa, who takes over? If the operations in Mosul succeed, who takes over? And you have a number of groups that seem poised to shoot at each other the moment the last Islamic State fighter is gone. And so I see it as a source of unity, but also as a source of division. The one thing that it leads the United States to consider, at least from, I think, a Trump administration's point of view, is the value of dictatorship. Where I think a number of advisors around Trump look back and say, when there is a stable dictatorship, the terrorism problem is greatly reduced. So it's better to have a stable dictatorship than chaos. And the lesson from the Arab Spring for many Trump advisors is that the alternatives in the Middle East are not between democracy and dictatorship, but between chaos and dictatorship. And that may be the wrong lesson, but they're not looking at the Middle East and finding examples of success in most places. And part of it is also a broader skepticism about the ability of the United States to create major change in the region. So one thing the Obama administration shares, I think, with many members of the Trump administration is a sense of American limits in the Middle East. So many Americans look at Iraq and say the United States invested hundreds of thousands of troops, over $1 trillion, and it was a disaster. They look at Libya and say the United States worked with NATO allies, it was a partial intervention, it was a disaster. The United States did very little in Syria. It was a disaster. So in the end, the result will be disaster regardless of what the United States does. And again, that attitude may be wrong, but the sense among the American people in the last 15 years is U.S. intervention, U.S. involvement in the Middle East is not positive, right? And this is, oddly enough to me, this was a sentiment of many people in the region for many years, which was it's time for the United States not to be involved in the Middle East. But my sense is this is shared now much more broadly, but the lack of American leadership, the void that was created, I think, under Obama and is likely to be continued under Trump, has tremendous consequences, and in my view, tremendously negative ones. And so I'm very concerned about this development in American foreign policy among both parties, because I think Obama was very cautious, and I think Trump is likely to be even more skeptical that the United States can do great things in its foreign policy in the Middle East.
Can I ask a question, Dan? I mean, why would the U.S. establishment think that Sisi regime is better than the Turkish regime, state? Why is not, you said, we have, I believe that it is supporting dictatorship that gave rise to this fanatical phenomena in the Middle East, these radicals that are against everything, that they want to create, destabilize everything. So why not taking an example of Turkey rather than bringing a regime, military regime, that is really creating in the next revolution that would be much more violence within Egypt? How is that? Why people in the U.S. are not looking into that
Dan,
dimension?
you can take that in your closing remarks, maybe.
Okay.
By way of providing a big picture. Also an opportunity to say that on the 16th, we have an event looking at 6 years after the Arab Spring. And that will be an opportunity to have a broader discussion. I have a few people here who are very upset with me. I'm going to go to you, sir, first. Briefly, please, because we're running out of time.
مساء الخير صحفي
Good evening. I'm a journalist from Arab newspaper. Mr. Moaz Al-Khatib, all the facts on the ground shows that Russia has imposed its point of view and the opposition is dismantled and divided, and there are regional powers that are fighting on the ground, while as the opposition itself bears responsibility because it is dismantled and not united, and their loyalties are different regional countries, and Russia now my question is, on the ground, what cards do the opposition still have in their hands? Do they have any pressure cards or have they surrendered themselves completely to what Russia does, especially that Trump will be with Russia, and in France there's a possibility that the new president will be also working and cooperating with Russia. So to Mr. Louay, you're betting on counting on the change on the region, but that failed. And the Arab regions now, one rejects all dictatorships, but the slogan today is that we want a stability that's better than destructions that are taking place in Libya. What do you think? I will not answer in an enthusiastic way, but in a logical way, but tell you, yes, inside the Syrian opposition there are problems, and one of Israel's problems is that some of the political forces, Islamists and non-Islamists, think in the version or the vision of the 60s and still don't understand what's happening and fighting windmills. And this has led to crises and disasters, and we put all the blame on the regime, what happened in Syria, well, despite the fact that they are a regime. And we did cooperate and get in touch with Russia 3 years ago, in fact. But I'm sorry to say that some people did not accept or absorb the Russian role, and they undermined our efforts and attacked those who tried to do something with Russia. Now, as Dr. Louay said, there is something very important that has nothing to do with the solution. It has to do with the psychology and the mentality. A big part of the Syrian people cannot, no way go back to be ruled by the regime, even if they will be killed. The reason is that the injustice they suffered from is so big and has nothing to do with the opposition. No, this has to do with the people itself. The people can no longer accept this dictatorship, no matter what price they might pay. That's why the solution to the problem is not easy, neither for the regime, nor for the Iranians, nor for the Russians. This people has broken its chains, and we don't want this freedom be accompanied by chaos. We want a solution with the least of losses for everybody. Now, if we see the opposition, whether military or political, they still have many cards in their hands. That is to say, the regions under the control of the opposition, or they are not under the control of the regime, are not little there. And there is the possibility of be out of the control of the regime. And the regime's weakness is also an encouraging factor for these forces on the ground, whether civilians or military. The absence of a clear vision within those who are occupying Syria, whether the Iranians or the Russians, this is also a weak point for them and gives strength to the people working on the ground. So, as I said, it's a very complicated situation and cannot be solved easily. And as I said in the beginning, we want a solution that with the least losses for everybody. And the regime has very much used and exploited the sectarian aspect in a very mean way, while as the opposition, frankly speaking, fell in the trap of something very naive. That's to say, the opposition in their essence are nationalists. They are not sectarian. They open their arms for everybody, and they never in their narrative had anything to do with the sectarianism, but they only wanted to get rid of the sectarianism situation of the regime, but could not well exploit this. And we find that many individuals publish some statements, including some language that is exploited by the regime who exploits this. And in fact, we are dealing with the whole issue in a naive way. The situation is very complicated, and it requires the requires to have a political humanitarian vision of a solution for the sake of Syria. Because as you know, Syria is the mosaic of all the world, has so many ethnicities, sects, cultures. So we should not limit our thinking, and that will lead to no result.
سأخذ 3 أسئلة فقط.
I'm going to take 3 questions only. Can I answer the question? Because the time is very limited. I'm going to take the rest of the questions, and I'm going to give you the opportunity to answer more than one question. Brother Zakaria, very, very briefly, please. In the name of God, the most compassionate. With regard to Sheikh Moaz Al-Khatib, you talked about the Egyptian position very briefly. The main beneficiary and the main supporter, the main beneficiary is Israel without spending a penny, without one shot, because they want a Syrian regime that is very deteriorated, and it is the Egyptian regime that is paying the price for the Russian intervention from our own hearts as Egyptians. A station that only cost 8 billion he gave it the Sisi to the Russians for 50 billions, and they gave them also a military camp also in Egypt, and he gave all of these things for $1 to Israel. So Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is the real crisis that we are facing, and he is the one that is killing Syrians. Thank you, Zakaria. I'm going to take the lady here at the back. Very briefly, please. May the peace of God be upon you.
Byman, please. Sheikh Moaz has pointed out that the West always fail how to appreciate the mentality in the Middle East, especially in the Arab world. Look at the example of yesterday, the young Palestinian who just killed 4 soldiers because of being desperate. This is one example how the Syrian people are becoming now very desperate. You talked about the choice between democracy or dictatorship or chaos. And you pointed out that the West preferred the dictatorship to the chaos. Mr. Einstein and even Martin Luther King have anticipated that the world will be destroyed not by the bad people, not by the villain, but as Martin Luther King said, by the appalling silence of the good people. Now, if we consider Mr. Obama was a good man because he won the Nobel Prize, what did his silence do to our people so far? I can't believe, nobody in the Syrian people believe that the West is ignorant of what is really going on, how Daesh became, or Nasra, or whatever. But we believe, after 6 months of peaceful demonstration, when there was no one shot going out, that the West has a conspiracy not to let the Syrian people win their freedom. And that will lead to more terrorism. As Noam Chomsky has anticipated that the current policy of the United States administration will create Daesh too, which will be more savage than the present Daesh.
Thank you. And finally, gentleman in front. Will you get us the mic, please? The mic here. باختصار لو سمحت.
شكرا جزيلا. أنا في الحقيقة يعني سؤال سريع.
I have a very quick question, because it seems that what is taking place in Syria and in the region as if that the Israeli factor does not exist. We know that Sykes-Picot took place in Israel, and everybody agrees in the region that is the new kind of Middle East that is going to divide the region into sectarian and racial kind of components, and that is why this has to do with the Israeli situation. I was hoping that if there is anybody of the speakers or panelists, if they have any comment about the Israeli component or factor and how they position this kind of factor in the situation.
Set of questions to close with whatever set of remarks. لكم الحرية في تصرف الوقت. سأبدأ بالدكتور لؤي.
أنا أريد أن
I would like to concentrate on the point that was mentioned by our friend about stability. Stability is a demand of humanity. We need to be stable for you to feel that you are secure and peaceful. This is very important and natural. But we have to look at stability from different or two dimensions. There is stability from the standpoint of power. That means that nobody can speak unless you get the authority of that regime that controls the components of society and that divides opportunities and wealth between people as they see suitable, especially in authoritarian regimes. They distribute opportunities depending on how far or close people are to the regime. If you criticize or ask for reforms, they are going to be deprived. And if you cooperate with the regime and accept the despotism of the regime, you're going to get more. So such a manner is not going to be useful today in the Middle East for many, many reasons. I would like to say that popular awareness is different now. The way they deal with the region is the old system, but the people in the Arab world is different. They are aware there is an advanced level of knowledge in the Middle East. These people are no longer 90% illiterate. There are so many university graduates who live in this area and who have no job opportunities, and the states in the Middle East, even the rich countries, cannot give job opportunities to their people, and maybe the future is going to be much more restrictive in terms of economic opportunities. So the solution is to try to reform the region, to have a real political participation, and to stop supporting dictatorships, because the dictatorships are the one that lead to extremisms in the region. It is due to dictatorships we had Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was nourished in the prisons of Egypt. The leader, the commander of the Al-Qaeda was a physician. Due to the injustices, he rejected the whole of the international community. I think stability will come from this standpoint. There are so many Syrians, so many Arabs that want any kind of stability, but due to the international dynamism and the demographic developments and economic developments are not going to allow to have a stability through centralized regimes that are in the hands of a very limited number of people. So we have to support democratic dynamisms or forms of dynamism. They're going to have an Islamist kind of spirit, which means that the values that they lean on in reforming the society, including equality, justice, and so on and so forth, these are emanating in all religions, even in the West. Without Christianity, you would not find any democratic commitment. Those who study democracy would find that the religious dimension had a role to play in the democracies of those countries. The decision makers in the US and in the West have to give the scope to the Islamist culture, because Islam, or religion in general, is the basis of any culture. We are with the fighting and combating of terrorists, those who want to impose themselves by killing and by landlines. landmines, sorry. And consequently, we have to rectify the official position and support real efforts, such as the Turkish effort. And this is my question here. Yes, the Turkish regime has so many negative points, but at least they have come up with a model that can be developed to be part of the international system, a system that respects human rights, the dignity of human beings, for human beings to be partners in the decision-making process. دقيقتين رجاء. Dan.
Make two big points. The first is that the United States has to choose, and I think the people of the region have to choose, whether it's a good thing for the United States to be more involved in the Middle East or less involved in the Middle East. Because if the United States is going to be involved in the Middle East, it's going to come with all the problems that have come with US involvement in the past. So it's not going to be an involvement that's culturally sensitive. It's not going to be an involvement that is even-handed between Israel and Palestinians. It's going to be an involvement that works with existing US allies, whether it's Saudi Arabia or other states. And so that's the kind of involvement the United States is going to have as it enters or as it increases its role. Or do you want a less involved United States where things as they happened in Syria in 2011, 2012 happened, where events spiraled out of control in part because the United States was not there to try to force settlements, to try to force military action, to try to solve problems when they were solvable. It's much more difficult to solve them today than it was then. A second issue is this question of stability. The historic US view was that dictatorships were stable. The problem that 2011 showed to this view was that dictatorships are not necessarily stable, and that in fact the best way to stability might involve instability. That if a dictatorship is collapsing on its own, if you want stability, the answer might not be to restore the dictatorship. It might be to try to work towards an alternative government situation that is stable. But here we have a tension between the short term and the long term. I think if you asked most American leaders, is it better for the region to not have dictatorship, they would say, of course. And should the United States be working towards that goal? Many would say yes. But if you ask them, should they do it today? They would say no. The United States needs to work with these governments. The United States needs to work with Sisi on security issues. It needs to work with a number of countries on counterterrorism. We can let democratic reform wait until tomorrow. And they would look at Turkey as a model, and I think they did in 2011, 2012, and said many Arab countries should look to Turkey for a model. But the problem was the unrest that developed led to more chaos, and the United States didn't have an ability to try to push them along a path that would make countries more like Turkey. And that points to a fundamental limit of the United States, which is it is not particularly able to affect the governance of countries in the region. Right? It can blow things up very, very effectively. Right? It can put economic pressure on countries, but it's very hard to effectively construct institutions of governance of any sort in any country, and that includes countries in this region. And that's been a fundamental limit on US policy when it's tried to be more ambitious.
Thank you. Sheikh Moaz.
عندي ثلاث نقاط.
I have 3 quick points. One, I think we will change the combating terrorism to absorbing terrorism. We have made a strategic mistake that is of using weapons and muscles against any force that faces us or confronts us. In North Syria, there were some experiences, and others in south of Syria. Some scientists, some enlightened and intellectual scholars have been able to absorb dozens of people who were tending to be extremist, but nobody supported their efforts, and the frustration led to a lot of polarization of the youth, and somebody might exploit these feelings in a correct or an incorrect way to say that all the world is against the Muslims, so we had to fight all the world. So what we have to do is not only to think about combating terrorism, this is a security thing that might be necessary, but the strategy is just to observe and contain terrorism. And then when things settle down in Syria, I'm 90% sure that most of the people want to go back to their work, their life, because they revolted against for their liberty and freedom. The other thing is about the role of Israel. I will say, frankly, that what's happening in Syria is only a beginning of a very important awareness for the Renaissance. Frankly speaking, we are retarded, we are underdeveloped humanitarianly speaking. I'm not saying that we should be like the Europeans or the West. No, even on the humanitarian level and cultural and intellectual level, we are a bit backward, where we have setbacks. And we have some problems in our thinking. That is to, we link effects to reasons in the wrong way. Because many Arab people think that results of things like happen by hazard or by coincidence or without planning, and this has affected us to a large extent in such a way that we link everything to external reasons. I'm sure that the country that most benefits from this is Israel. That's for sure. But it's not Israel that's planning or doing many things. The Syrians were surprised to see this strong army that can fight and kill for 6 years and has this military might. Why was this army made and created? We usually link the results to the reasons and in a wrong way, and this leads to a wrong way of thinking. The peoples who really want to control their fate, they can do so if they think the right way. This might take a long time, it requires a lot of efforts and bloodshed, but to think in this way would lead to no result. Whenever there's a problem, we say it is this country that creates our problems. No, we are responsible of our own problems. And this leads to a way of thinking in the future in the wrong way. That's to say, what is the future of the Syrian state? Many people think that there's a sort of Western democracy that's the best example for us. This is not correct. Do you know what's the best democracy in the world? It's not the Scandinavian countries. No, it's India. India has a mixture of ethnic groups, cultures, religions that no democratic country in the world can absorb and contain. So one year the president is a Muslim, another is a Buddhist, and they live in a good harmony, in a good social fabric. But to think out of this natural context will lead us to problems. The last point, we can't hear what the lady is saying. She's not using a mic. I think she's saying even if Assad is no longer in Syria, the bloodshed will continue. We still can't hear her, sorry. So what we need is a sort of something to accompany the revolutions, that's a sort of cultural, religious awareness, and to change to a higher level of humanitarian thinking. Thank you very much.
Active. معلش يا أختي أختي العزيزة الفاضلة.
Excuse me, lady, please excuse me. In the coming in the near future, we'll have other activities also about other events about Syria, including some humanitarian aspects that affect the future of the Syrian people as displaced people, as refugees. All these points we will be discussed in future events, and we will discuss them as scholars, as analysts, and as institutions. in the hope that in the beginning of this event, I could say that 2017 is I hope it will be a beginning of some hope for stability and return of normal things to life to Syria.
For being a part of a very rich discussion this evening. This will not be the only discussion we will have in 2017 on Syria. In a few months, inshallah, we will organize another event. We have an event coming on the 16th of January, which is a week from now, that will be devoted to an issue that came up in a lot of questions and some of the answers today. Namely, 6 years after the Arab Spring, what are the lessons we have learned? What is likely to happen? But for now, I'd like you to join me in giving a very warm round of applause.